director of the 1199 SEIU League Training and Upgrading Fund. We had a funder visit yesterday, and they remarked that we are very good at creating very, very long names for our organization. I think HCAP asked me to do this not because of my present role, but because I used to be the Deputy Secretary for Workforce Development in the state of Pennsylvania, and then after that the Secretary of Labor. So I have some experience with the public workforce system. When I was putting this presentation together, I wasn't frankly sure how much background people had. So what I'm going to do is go through a number of relatively dense slides fairly quickly to give as much background as I can, and then towards the end of the presentation, there will be, I'm going to facilitate a discussion so that I make sure that we really covered the information that you feel like you need, but also it'll give us some opportunity to brainstorm about how we can leverage the public workforce system for additional funding and strategic alliances. So with that, I'm going to start. Can I suggest, just as a protocol, while I'm going through the background piece, I'm going to ask Safrina to mute us all, but if you have questions on the content, isn't there a way that they can write their questions in? So I'll pay attention to that. So and ask, you could just hit mute all, Safrina. So if you, so we muted you just because of the background noise, but if you have a question, sort of raise your hand or whatever you can do electronically, and we'll unmute you, especially if it's something about the content, about what I'm going through, recognizing that there will be opportunities to brainstorm at the end. So with that, I'm going to start. So let's see. Uh-oh. Okay. All right. So very dense slide, but I want to go through because I think you'll see the evolution of the ideology of job training in the United States. So the very first, the first one that people think about in terms of job training in the modern era is the Manpower Development Act of 1962. So if you think about the time in which this was passed, we were still in an era of relative organized labor power. The social contract or the economic contract was still relatively intact. We had a strong middle class, and you could debate that around the edges, but that's certainly more true than it was today. So, but also if you remember, even the original National Labor Relations Act back in the 30s left out lots of people, particularly farm workers, particularly domestic workers. The Manpower Development Act of 1962 was an attempt to focus on the people who were left out of that general economic contract. So the people who were making relatively low wages in a society where we had a stronger middle class than we do today. Important to note, and this becomes clearer and clearer in terms of an ideological bent as we move forward to the additional federal job training legislation, is that it's the seeds of using job training to move us out of poverty. And I say that because that's not exactly the labor management construct for job training, and it is a difference, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So then 1972, the CETA, it's called, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. Here we start to see the engagement of private industry, but still there is a focus on public jobs. So the ideology isn't entirely about what does the private sector or the labor market left to its own devices provide in terms of jobs, and it'll all be fine if just people have the skills. There's still at this point a recognition that there aren't enough jobs for everybody, and that with a public jobs program you can both build skills but also provide a source of middle wage employment, or at least entry-level wage employment. big philosophical debate whether it's ideological or whether there was corruption in the system, but that goes away. Then that's replaced in 1982 by the Job Training Partnership Act, what people lovingly call as JTPA. And it's at this point that dislocated or unemployed workers are added. So now the recognition that we've moved to an economy, some people call it creative destruction, but in any event, that there's a movement away from full employment, particularly full employment at middle-class wages, and the ideology of, or the philosophy of, well, people had skills or retraining they could get or return to those middle-class jobs starts to really coalesce as part of our national thinking around job training. And then that gets further coalesced in 1998 under Clinton, and it becomes not about anti-poverty strategies in terms of partnering that with job training, but really about the private sector dictates the terms of the market, and we just need to train people. There are good jobs out there, right? So that's, and again, there's a big current debate about that, but that is what's philosophically driving that, and I highlight that because just at the time where that economic contract is starting to break down, the fix, if you will, that's envisioned as job training. In our context, we believe that job training, education is part of a benefit that workers should have, but it's necessary but not sufficient. We believe in collective bargaining to build both the power of the workforce, but also the economic conditions. And our employers actually are also believe in that. They believe in collective bargaining. They might not always necessarily believe in the very specifics, but most of them believe that through collective bargaining you can create a host of better work conditions, not just training. So the elements of this system, very private sector driven, lots of employer input. You start to hear the rhetoric around employers leading, lot of trainee or job seeker choice, which is where you get the individual training accounts. There were some things that were designed to fix prior systems, and it was true that under JTPA, the training entities often had a huge control on the system, so that there was a lot of training going on, and you'll hear President Biden say this, you know, train and pray, or training for jobs that don't exist. The Workforce Investment Act was the first attempt to break that training provider hold on the public system. It created a set of one-stop career centers where all job seekers, including those who are unemployed, could go to seek employment and get training. But it also had a job-first philosophy to it, so that training was not necessarily the primary function of the system, but helping people find employment. So it wasn't always just about skills building. So then just last year, WIOA, Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, was passed. It's very similar. I'm going to go in more detail, but it's very similar to WIA. There are two critical differences, and I'm going to discuss these, but there is a focus on what they call sector partnerships, and there is a focus on career pathways, which opens the door to more longer-term training than the system could support in the past. And it's also, in theory, a common set of data and credentials across the different funding streams is supposed to drive the system. And it continues to have that employer engagement piece that I talked about. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So let me just quickly, at the same time that all of this is going on, there are other programs, other public sector job training programs that I want to highlight. Wagner-Peiser is a funding stream that started in 1933. That funds civil service workers. They were originally in job centers. It started as a mechanism to help connect people to WPA or public works projects in the Depression. These were the public sector workers who connected people to public sector jobs. And hopefully most of you know what the WPA was. And that evolved over time. And throughout time, it was focused on providing job matching to unemployed workers. And now they're a mandatory partner in the one-stops, or what are now called the American Job Centers. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, I didn't put the date on that. It's 1972 or 74, I can't remember which, but it's in the 1970s that this first came about. And this was in response to free trade agreements, which, as you know, got progressively more aggressive. And the notion was that anyone who was negatively impacted by imports, or their job went away because the jobs were being exported, would have the opportunity to retrain. And the important thing to note about this program is that this is the richest set of benefits. There's income support for 2 years, as well as training eligibility for 2 years. Of course, we could have a philosophical discussion about whether it worked or not, but that is the program. The biggest program by far, it's not the one we talk most about. I think it's actually a typo, but I have it there twice, so we'll say that that actually wasn't a typo, and it's there because it's actually the biggest monetary program, is the TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or what we used to call welfare to work, employment and training programs. I'm not going to spend too much time on those, but if at the end you have questions, states are free to structure these programs in lots of different ways. They can often be structured fairly problematically. Typically, we don't work in this world unless we're getting grant money to work with people outside of our covered members and helping move people into entry-level positions that are covered under the collective bargaining agreement. The programs vary from state to state. There's often work requirements for people to get their benefits. If you have any interest in understanding progressive ways to structure these programs, there's an entity called CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy, and we can send that to you if this is something that you want to engage in or talk about it. And then the last one I want to talk about is the food stamp employment and training programs. Again, much like the TANF programs, these are population specific and designed to help provide people who are using food stamps with employment and training to move out of poverty so that they're no longer reliant on food stamps. So let me give you the WIA or WIOA basics, just again, because I think many of you know this. I won't, except Safrina, I won't be able to see if they have questions. So, yeah, I think it's okay. Couple of basics. So hopefully you've all heard of a state or local workforce investment board. Largely at the state level, they're very policy focused, and it's your state Department of Labor, usually, that controls the actual money. At the local level, they do have more of an investment focus, although they don't actually do the specific contracts. In some cases, particularly in high-functioning areas, they can set priorities for investment. And then they tend to, depending on how well they're run, have a focus on developing policy priorities for the elected officials at the state or local level to develop strategies. Couple of key things that are new under WIOA: 20% of the state and local workforce investment boards have to be worker representatives, and that includes representatives from labor as well as representatives from labor management training partnerships. Still central to the system, they're now called American Job Centers, but this is the place where people are supposed to go if they're unemployed or low income or looking for a better job, and it's where you can connect both to training and employment matching services. The important point for us here is that this is also where people access their individual training accounts. And so they maintained in the new system this notion of consumer choice so that job seekers, whether employed or low income, could select training from among a list of training providers using an individual training account. The truth is that this system has been so underfunded that there's very, very little money typically available for individual training accounts. We're going to talk a little more about that when we get to the strategic. Here's the other piece that I think has a real potential to be useful to our training funds and the labor management partnerships. The law now requires local workforce investment boards to develop sector partnerships, and states are permitted to invest in them with their discretionary funds. The state plans, as well as the local plans, have as required partners for their sector partnerships employers, labor, and higher ed. The caveat for labor is it has to be where labor represents workers. So they may not be required partners in sectors where there's not labor representation, such as technology or maybe Louisiana. I couldn't think of a state where there's low. That was the first one that came to mind. Okay, and then the other piece is career pathways. Again, significant to us because it allows for longer-term training as well as training for incumbent workers. So that's going to be important because the local areas now have to create plans that talk about the development of sector partnerships and the development of career pathways. It's a site where we might be able to interject the good practice that we already do. Uh-oh. I am hitting down. Give us a second. We're just having a momentary glitch. Oh, there it is. Okay. This you will have. We'll send this out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. They eliminated 15 existing programs. I'm not sure that any of them are that significant to us, but you should just know that these were eliminated. And if you were accessing funds through any of these programs, they're gone and they're replaced with other things, but these are gone. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so let's talk about some really important things. First, WIOA restored the governor's actually 15% money. Right now, it's at about 8%. By July, it's supposed to go to 10%. And just so you understand what we're talking about there, that is discretionary money that can be used for sector partnerships, development and implementation of career pathways, promotion of best practices. It's encouraged strongly in the law that the governor use this to design these sector partnerships and foster their development. So in a state where they've not engaged in sector practice, and so let me just define for those of you who don't know what sector practice, what I'm talking about, that's what we do. We are a sector partnership. Labor management partnerships are precisely that. We bring together worker representatives and employers to understand the needs of the industry and to create training that's aligned to industry needs. That's what they're talking about, sector partnerships. The reason that's an opportunity is for the local areas that have not engaged in that, we can easily step in and fit their bill and sort of leverage some of the resources. There's challenges, and I'm going to get to that. But okay, so here are some additional federal grants. Let me, you can read the slide, but the important thing to note here is that the federal grants are now supporting a couple of things. Longer-term training, always training for unemployed, what the president and the vice president called Earn While You Learn, which is the apprenticeship model. So there are increasing opportunities for us to weigh in because their strategies have changed somewhat. Still, again, there are going to be challenges, but there are opportunities for us to get involved. Okay, so I talked about governor's 10% money. If there's governor's 10% money, that means that 90% of the Workforce Investment Act money and a lot of the other partnering money, like literacy money, is actually spent at the local level and to a greater or lesser extent controlled by the local workforce investment boards. It's sort of 101 of local workforce investment boards is that it requires a private sector chair. It's very focused on employer engagement and employers defining the strategy. This works out differently in different areas, but the new requirement under WIOA is that there's 20% labor representatives on these local boards. And as you can see, I'm just repeating here, that they're required to develop sector partnerships, create a career pathway plan. And here's a really important point. The workforce investment boards are not just nominated, but the fiscal agent is the lead local elected official. In many cases, for us, that means the mayor. It could also mean a county exec. In a multi-county workforce investment area, they typically nominate, but you get the general idea that there's going to be political leverage there, particularly if it's the mayor that we work with, or et cetera. Leverage. Okay, so a couple of other things that are relatively important, that's different things that are useful to us. There's a bunch of different titles in the Workforce Investment Act, or now the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Title I. Wait, was there a question there? Oh, these are just...
That's on the pass.
Okay, that's a pass. Okay. Title I. Oh, what's the question? Are these partnerships for the purposes of creating jobs only? No, they're not for the purposes of creating jobs, Court. They're actually for the purpose of creating job training strategies. They run much like, they're trying to recreate, frankly, labor management partnerships without the collective bargaining agreement, without sometimes labor at the table. But the notion is that they create an investment strategy sector by sector, and that they're focused on the sectors that are most relevant to their local labor market, and that they're creating a job training strategy that helps people move into that sector or helps people move or advance along a career path within that sector. So it's not actually a job creation strategy, although it is supposed to be aligned to whatever job creation strategies exist for the sector through economic development or through the sector itself. Okay, so integrating literacy, I'm sorry, so I talked about Title II. There's a bunch of different titles. I just talked about the main title, which is called Title I and largely run out of the Department of Labor. Title II of the Workforce Investment Act, and this is relevant to us, is run out of the U.S. Department of Education and typically goes to the State Department of Education and then to local providers. These are the literacy programs that are intended to be tied to work outcomes, and there's a big debate about whether they're well tied to work outcomes or not. But the bottom line is under WIOA, there's a push and an encouragement to combine literacy with occupational training, much in the way that we do it. Those of you who are familiar with your local literacy programs know that sometimes they're somewhat disjointed from occupational training. The other key things to just note, I already talked about the President's emphasis on earn and learn, or apprenticeships, which is the last bullet, but they're also changing, and the regs, a bunch of regs just came out today. I didn't have a chance to read them, but new regulations are supposed to come out which will define this better, but it's looking at progress indicators that take people from where they are as opposed and look at employment and credential progress as opposed to what happened in the past, which is, did people move up a grade level, did they get a job? This is supposed to be focused much more on high quality employment outcomes and long-term outcomes. We don't know what that means yet because the regulations haven't been written. Okay, so let me just go through a couple of key things. Local workforce investment boards are difficult to work with because they're not because they don't like us, but because they're afraid that union or labor management partnerships that, let's move that now so they can actually read the, can they, because I don't think they can read it. Oh, they can read it? Okay. Okay. That local workforce investment boards are afraid of union because they're afraid that unions will scare away employers, and they feel as if in order to make the system work, and they're being told that, they need the engagement of employers. Employer engagement is sort of the holy grail of the public workforce system these days. And then let me just sort of summarize. Working with the system hinges on two things: political power and or outcomes. And I'm going to talk mostly about how to talk about our outcomes to work with them, and but when we get to the brainstorming, we'll talk about the political power piece, because I don't think anybody is a stranger to how we leverage our political power to work with local workforce, to work with anybody. Okay, so just to be clear, the labor management training funds and or training partnerships or training entities or labor training entities have better outcomes than the public system by a country mile. And there's all sorts of documentation. I can share with you at some later date, if this becomes useful to you, what the public system looks at as success. And if you compare that with your own success, you'll see that we're already our outcomes are much, much better. So we employ people at good wages, and we also advance people along career pathways. So leveraging that is really key to leveraging resources. So that's the context for approaching a local workforce investment board and getting funded. I want to talk and strategize about how you might approach, but first I want to just go through 3 different scenarios. The first scenario is an ask that's likely to get rejected. If you ask for something that's about capacity building, it's very likely to get rejected. They're looking for outcomes, and typically they're looking for outcomes that take less than 2 years in duration. That's not universally true, but that is mostly true. And when I say mostly, like 95% mostly. So you'll see in this scenario of my ask, a capacity building grant for a lab tech program. People are already employed at relatively high wages as lab technicians. The program is 2 years in duration. There's no guaranteed wage increase, and there's no employer support. That would likely never be funded. You're not likely to go with that ask, but I wanted to talk through some of the elements. Because often we're looking for money for staffing or something. What they want to fund is our training and the things that lead to measurable outcomes. So here's a bunch of things that they're likely to say yes to. And these may or may not be strategic. I don't want to suggest that they're not, I say may not be strategic, but you should decide locally whether these are strategic. So now you might be able to get on your local workforce investment board. That may just suck up your time, but if they're in the middle of a planning process, like they're about to start now under the new legislation, that could be strategic, because you could interject prioritizing the healthcare sector, pathways for incumbent workers. Providing CNA training for 10 unemployed workers might be strategic if that's a need in your area, but if that's not a need, then you're just basically meeting their needs and not your own. And then you'll see some of my other examples: attend a meeting just to be window dressing. Let me just talk about registering as an individual training provider, an ITA or an individual training account provider. In order to do that, you have to share all of your outcomes. So since we're typically using vendors, this only makes sense if there's a training that you're providing that you're willing to share all the outcomes for all participants, not just those who are registered through the ITA. The way we've done this here locally, and I think in Pennsylvania, is rather than having the training fund register as an ITA provider or an individual training account provider with the system, have your vendor register for the specific program. So Lehman College registers its patient care technician program. people can do a group registration right at the campus or even at the one stop if they insist, then you're leveraging the money that's available through that ITA to pay for that training. It's difficult, and you have to work with the system to make sure that it doesn't become just another barrier for members, but that's a more strategic way to do that than trying to register yourself. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit more about a strategic ask. They're much more likely to support midterm training, and I gave you just some examples, but it should be focused on areas where it matters to you as the job training fund, not just to your local area. So are there shortages in the area? Do you want to do a combination of some unemployed workers and some incumbent workers? Let me just say that they will want to focus either on lower wage workers or unemployed workers as part of whatever grant you give them. So that's a place where you have to be strategic about your ask. A lot of times you might be able to say, well, if there are home care workers or workers who are in dietary and they're going to get an upgrade, that can be a strategic ask too. But you should always remember that their primary focus, particularly less and less right now because the economy is getting better, but for the last 4, 5, 6 years has been on helping unemployed workers get into jobs. Again, partnering with their local community colleges because they typically have relationships there. They want us because, frankly, they don't have the capacity to do things like recruitment, screening, and wraparound services, so that's another part of the strategic ask. And then the other piece that is important is structure the program so that the outcomes are guaranteed outcomes. And what do I mean by that? Of course, you're not going to have a 100% success rate, but you're going to say, I'm going to do a, I'm making this up now, community health worker program, and I have, and you'll see this as the last bullet, an employer lined up to hire 15 people so that if all 15 people make this through, they're very likely to get hired. Right, so that's what I mean by structure it so that the outcomes are likely to be guaranteed. Okay, this is just really summarizing what I just said. They care, the local WIBs and fiscal agents as well as the state care about new employment. They want employment for unemployed workers. But sometimes you can convince them to care about wage increases, which is very useful for us. And they very much care about employer engagement. They don't care as much about labor engagement unless they're forced to through political means. But we do bring both to the table, and that's an important part to leverage. So with that, I'm going to unmute, and let's do some brainstorming and see what questions you have. And I have a question for you. So let's ask your question first. But my question for you is, what's your goal with working for the with the public training system? Okay, so I don't know how. Give us a minute. We're just unmuting. There we go. Wait, should be a way to unmute all, huh? You missed somebody. Okay, just bear with us.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, a lot of people are unmuted. We're just trying to unmute everybody.
You should now be open.
Okay, so questions for people?
Well, this is Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Lisa. Okay, so I just want to remind everybody that you're unmuted, so if you could try and keep the background noise to a minimum, that would be great. Okay, Lisa, go ahead. What's your question?
Well, just on working with the public jobs training system, I think part of what we want to do is gain resources to do more with our members, and that also is demonstrates value to employers of being a part of the fund. It sounds like I have a terrible connection.
No, you're fine. We're having just technical difficulties here.
Okay. But I think for us in Pennsylvania, growing our fund is really important. And if we say, you know, we are able to augment what your contributions are to the training fund with grant funding or public workforce dollars, that makes us more valuable and it's more likely for our employers, you know, will want to be a part of it or see the value of being a part of it and agree to it in contract negotiations. So, yeah.
Oh, I see. So leveraging dollars to support your work, but also to leverage, to show value in collective bargaining.
More employers in to attract employers. Yeah, to attract employers. Employers in collective bargaining.
Got it. I'm going to let Daniel do this so I can talk and he can type. Okay, so that's great. Well, Lisa, I want to ask other people that have questions, but Lisa, was what I shared in terms of strategic asks helpful?
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, I think I knew some of it, but I think we are in a position now where we can start actually getting involved with the local workforce investment board. And frankly, in the past, I did feel like, oh, I'm wasting my time here because it was like I had no opportunity. You know, it just seemed like a time suck. And I think now are at a place where we have a you know, favorable governor and administration where it will be worth our time to figure out how to build those relationships.
Okay, great. How about others? Other people either want to share their goal and or ask a question? Really, no one?
Well, I was just going to wait and see if anybody else had anything. I'm getting feedback. Is everybody else hearing that feedback or just me?
I'm not hearing it.
Okay.
Is anybody else?
Well, it's a little confusing to talk when I'm hearing myself repeated all the time, but I'll try to do this. One of the things that we want to use the system for is to, one, what Lisa said, to leverage more support, to do more of what we already do, but also to support people who aren't eligible under our funds, and also to do programs which we can't do using under our training funds.
So when you say support people not eligible under your funds, who would that be, Cord?
People who don't have their one-year eligibility in, or they don't work enough hours in our shops, or even people who are at facilities that we want to get into the fund, we want to start working with them and show them what we can do.
So I think, you know, of those things that you said, one thing that would be attractive to a local workforce area would be people who aren't working enough hours, right? So the notion of helping people who are part-time move to full-time would be really helpful. I also think, you know, talking about employers who aren't in your fund but that they would benefit from it. I think the one thing that is usually a big no from the local workforce investment area is things that don't lead to an upgrade, which is typically an area where a lot of our funding can't be used now. But if there's not an upgrade attached to it, that's not typically something that the local workforce investment area is going to be that interested in either. I don't know if that's helpful information to have or not.
Yeah, some of it I didn't hear. I got cut off for some reason here when you were talking.
I said it's likely that helping people move from part-time to full-time work would be attractive to a local workforce investment area. Helping employers who aren't in the fund would also be attractive. But when we talk about programs that we don't presently do, the area that they're going to be least attracted to is the area like a workplace skills program that doesn't lead to an upgrade. They're going to be very focused on moving low-wage or unemployed workers or part-time workers to full-time. So it's all about moving people to higher employment outcomes. So that's one area that they're not good sources of, that you're more likely to find money from foundations if there's not an upgrade attached to it.
What about literacy stuff? Will they help us with any of our adult ed work?
So that's a really good question. So I think the answer is we don't know. Under the old system, so everybody heard Court's question. It's about what about the adult literacy. Under the old system, the states largely contracted this out to community-based providers. We were really not likely to get those funds unless we were willing to open up to the general public. However, with this new focus on occupational skills combined with literacy, I think there's an opening there. When the regulations come out, we should take a quick look at that, but that could be a real opportunity for us. I think that the challenge, Court, is going to be they're not going to want to fund it for just our covered members. They're going to want to look at it more broadly. We might be able to leverage it so that it's covering our members and others, but I don't think it would be to the exclusion of others. So that's, again, a place where we'd have to do some strategic thinking to see if we could open our programs up and got funded and it would offset some of our costs, if that's something we'd be willing to do.
Yeah, so for instance, we have a program at Strong Hospital for people to train to be PCTs, but they have to reach a certain education level before they can get into the program. And right now we do all of that remediation for them. So if we had if we said to the WIB, we have a program that people can go into at Strong Hospital, but they need remediation before they can get into it, is that a direct enough line where we have support from an employer, a clear job upgrade, and or it may not be literacy, but it's remedial education to get them up to a certain level?
I think that's a really strategic ask, and then the push and pull is going to be how many 1199 members versus others, and that's that's something you would have to sort of negotiate with them. But I think that's a very strategic ask.
Mm-hmm. And the same thing we do for some of our CNA work we're doing.
Yep, that would be another. Again, that would be something that the local area would like very much. So let me just open up other questions, other goals that we're not talking about.
I have another question. This is Lisa, but I'll wait until other people's ask, but I wanted to make sure I got in before we moved on.
Okay, well, we definitely will get to you, but we're trying. There's other people on the call. Nobody else has a question?
This is Kelly from
Did you understand?
LA.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah?
I'm wondering, one of the things I definitely experienced, so I can't remember who said it, but somebody else saying they feel like the meetings can sometimes be a time suck and not productive. But I also find myself getting lost in all of the different programs. So even, it was helpful to hear what you said. Do you have any recommendations of like sites to look at or anything to better understand the program, so as we're trying to think of ways to do different proposals, we can fully understand like what are the regulations for each program?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let us think about that and see if we can't send some stuff out to you. It is fairly opaque.
Yeah, this is Daniel from HCAP. So absolutely, what Sandy's saying is absolutely true. It is fairly opaque. I mean, there are a couple of, and Sandy actually mentioned class. There's NSCs, but there's stuff that we have actually begun putting together as well, in concert, and moving forward in concert with the IU as well. So let's take a look at that and see what's available and what we could potentially put out too.
So why don't we look at so HCAP would put out to the people on this call plus all of the affiliates
Correct.
some information
Correct.
in the next
Right, because right now we've been waiting for a little while on the proposed rule to be posted to the Federal Register.
And I believe it was posted today.
So when I heard Sandy say it was posted today, so we should have some more information in it pretty quickly afterwards, okay?
Yeah, I mean, when we say quick, it may take us a little while.
It may take a little while to do it, but it won't be months and months down the line is what I'm saying. Because the original plan was to have this implemented by the federal government in July of 2015.
Which is fast approaching. And let me just also say, related to that, you know, they all talk in acronyms, and it's all so crazy stuff.
Yeah.
I think you should never be afraid to ask what an acronym means, because if you don't know what it means, probably there are other people, particularly if there are employers or our labor partners sitting in the room, there's probably other people in the room who don't know what it means either. So you'd be doing people a favor if you said, what does ITA mean, individual training account, or what does WIOA stand for? So I wouldn't be shy about asking those questions.
This is Robin from Buffalo. I have a question.
Robin?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm thinking about some of our workers who need to get a certificate or take an exam to get certified to keep or upgrade. What about would this be able to be used for that kind of training? Specifically, I'm thinking about our certified medical assistants. One of our facilities is trying to make a move to have more certified medical assistants. There are people who need to take that exam to get certified, or our farm techs who are not certified who need to be certified. Is this something that we could use it for and maybe show some value to the employer about getting people to the place where they're looking to have their workers be?
So the short answer is it depends. The long answer is that's exactly what we did in New York. We actually worked with employers and the local system on a medical assistant certification program. So they were incumbent medical assistants who'd largely been trained on the job or in a short-term program. We did a program where they would get the national certification. The key thing that's going to be important to your local workforce investment area, whether it's the WIB or the fiscal agent, is whether or not there's an upgrade. They're not going to do it if there's not an upgrade attached to it.
Okay.
But that actually is an example of a really good program. The employers are saying they want it. You're getting people wage gains, so then the local area gets to show that there were wage gains as a result of the training. So that's actually a very good ask.
So I just want to make sure I understand. By upgrade, does it have to be an upgrade in job title, or could it be an upgrade in just pay?
Just pay.
Okay.
I mean, both is great, but they care about wage. The term, they don't use the term upgrade, they use the term wage gains.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have another question, but I know Lisa was going to ask something.
All right. Lisa, go ahead. You can go next then. Lisa? Okay, while we're waiting.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm here. I'm sorry.
Hi. That's all right.
Okay, so following up on Court's ask about adult literacy made me think about computer literacy and you know, kind of technological training, whether it be computers or tablets or whatever it is that, you know, to help our members become literate with everyday technology. That doesn't necessarily result in an upgrade. So I imagine that the WIB would not be interested in that.
not funding you to do it. They might say, oh, we've got a partner that's already doing it, send your people there. But no, that's not going to be something they're going to be interested in. Now, let's say you were doing something that led to an upgrade in an embedded computer literacy. They wouldn't object to that. But just computer literacy for incumbent workers, it's not going to be enough of an outcome for them to report to the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
So I'm wondering about ITA. We have historically worked with the WIBs here back prior to 2009 and 2010 when there was a lot more of the ITA funding. We had a really, at least in Syracuse, we had a really good relationship with them where all of our members went to file for ITA money, and that offset a lot of our LPN expenses here. And then it kind of died after the recession. And I'm wondering about what's the status that you know of with ITAs now, because I think that's a huge source of money that we should really be figuring out how to tap into pretty systematically.
So it varies from local area to local area, but the one thing I will tell you is that the federal reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, did not fully restore all the money that had been lost. So it still means that there's limited amounts of these individual training accounts, but there is a huge push from the federal government to invest more in training and less in other stuff. And they really focused on, it says in the law now that people should get career planning services, but it is not necessary for people to get job matching services or any services before they enter training. So in other words, there used to be something that was interpreted as, I don't want to get too technical, but the job first part that I talked about, the law explicitly says that you do not need to look for a job before you enter training. And so that's signaling to the system that more money should go to training. So I think it's probably timely to revisit that with your local areas, your local workforce areas. But I don't want to give too much hope because there is the funding cuts from the federal government have been severe.
Yeah.
Does everybody understand what I talked very briefly about these ITAs, and I gave you a scenario under which it would make sense to leverage those individual training accounts. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay, so I have another question for all of you, and you are free to ask questions at any time. But what do you need? In other words, I did this presentation not knowing how much you already knew. What do you need to accomplish your goals? What tools do you need to accomplish your goals with the local system? We gave it all to you. We were perfect. None of you even laughed.
Well, this is Lisa again. I'm just talking too much, and that's why I hesitated. But
okay. Nobody else is, so you're probably saying things that other people think.
One thing that I think, I'm trying to now. I think I mentioned earlier. Like I feel like now we're established enough, and we're stable enough, and we're big enough that we can figure out now how to really engage with our local workforce investment boards. And you had mentioned the 20% participation needs to be from the labor partnerships or labor. And what would you recommend be the step to take to get our folks on those local boards?
So you know what?
Or engaged. How do we get engaged at the local level?
Okay, so I'm going to go to the next steps, and we can come back to these, if you don't mind, because I actually have a step-by-step. Go to the last slide 18 yet. So here's the next steps. So, okay, so there's, I'm putting these into 3 buckets. The first thing I would do is research. So, you know, Lisa, you're statewide, but others are more, others are concentrated, others are not concentrated. So the first thing is, does your state have a sector or industry partnership strategy now? And what I mean by that is some states are already engaged in that. Washington State is engaged in that. Pennsylvania just announced industry partnerships. I think San Francisco is engaged in that. So if you're in an area where they've never done this, that's important to know too, because it gives you a big opportunity. So, but the first thing is to research what is, if any, the state or local area sector or industry partnership strategy. So that's the very first piece of information. So Lisa, you're not going to do that for each local area. In Pennsylvania, you're going to focus where that's relevant, like Pittsburgh, like Central, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The second piece is, have they announced anything related to the planning process for their new Workforce Investment Act plan? Again, they should be starting that process relatively soon because implementation is supposed to start in July. I don't yet know when the plans are due, but they're starting to think now about how they're going to formulate these new plans. And what do I mean by the plan? That's their state plan, which signals a set of priorities about how they're going to spend their public dollars, and their local plan that does the same thing. So you should know right for now what that process is. And then the other piece of research, who's already on the state WIB, who's already on your local WIB. And then the final piece of research, who actually oversees, who controls the money at the local area. So at the state area, it's going to be pretty easy to figure out. It's likely your State Department of Labor. Some cases, it's like I think Washington State, it's not I think it's some combined entity. But you should know who the state entity is and the local entity and who is fiscally responsible. Is it the mayor? Is it the county exec? Is it 3 county, you know, whatever. So once you have those pieces of information, then I would suggest that even before you meet with your local fiscal, the people who are in charge of the money, to ask if you can be on the board, go with your union and or employers, or both, even better, to meet with your chief executive officer, what's called your chief executive officer. I mean by that, that's the mayor, that's your governor, and particularly where you have a relationship, I would meet there first. And those are the people who actually appoint people to the local or state workforce investment boards.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your governor at your state level, your mayor or county exec or whoever at your local level. And that's who I would ask to join the board before you even ask the Workforce Investment Board executive director. If you remember, I said earlier, this is like part politics, part outcomes, you know, part that we do good programs. This is where the political power of your labor management partnership comes into play. And then I would also meet with the people who are administering the programs at the state and local area. And I would not, in that first meeting, do an ask. I would make sure that they get to know you and talk about your outcomes. A lot of times they're going to think, oh, you only do this for union members. They don't know, for instance, that's required by law that our money only be used for that. They don't understand that a lot of what we do is, in fact, moving people who are in entry-level positions to middle wage and middle skilled jobs already. So they don't really understand what we do. And so that first meeting with those people who administer the program should really talk just about what we do so they have a better understanding. And then, can they see that? Can we just, they can see it? They're not seeing that. Okay. Okay. So then I would, after you've talked to them and you understand their priorities, then that's when I would formulate the ask based on a lot of the needs that you've just described. And I would focus on, you know, talking about the fact that we deliver outcomes, leveraging our outcomes. Consider, it's not always possible, but can you include some of their target population, like people who are unemployed, in the strategic ask that you're making? That may not always be feasible. You may say, you know what, we just can't do that right now, given what's going on in our particular, you know, industry or sector. And then note always that you're delivering matching funds, because typically you are, right? You're delivering case management if they're not paying for that, or you're delivering, maybe you're using some of your funds to pay for some fund-covered union members to participate in the program. So I would make sure that they understood and counted that as leverage or matching dollars. Any questions on that?
Very, very helpful.
Does anybody have any questions on anything? If I gave you a quiz and said, what's CETA stand for, would anybody actually know what that was? We send these out though, right, so they have it. And so the history isn't that relevant, except that it defines the philosophical shift over time. Any questions at all from anybody? Should we end?
This is Kelly again in LA. Just a quick question. So that last slide is super helpful. If we don't know the answers to those questions already, where would we find them? I'm thinking especially in the beginning.
Right. So the first place I would start is the website of your local workforce investment board. And then look at the membership of the state and local workforce investment board. You may find a kindred spirit, like maybe there's a labor representative. There usually is a labor representative already there. Maybe you want to even just, you know, if it's somebody you know, pick up the phone and call them and ask them and get the background information. And then the other thing I would say is Daniel and I can probably also help you if you're still having a hard time if you start there. You know, what I don't want to do is send you to their really complicated long plans. That's one way to find out, but there are probably easier ways by talking to people who you know who are already on the board. That's what I would do to start before I started like reading the plans that they already have in place. And a lot of times their websites say it. You know, they'll say, we're supporting technology, sector partnership, or whatever. So those are the places I would start, and the informal interviews with people who you know are already engaged. And if that still doesn't work, then double back, and Daniel and I can be a resource to help you from there.
That's great. Do you usually find that like what they publish is what's actually happening, or is it like, you know, with organizations, you can look at the org chart, but then you talk about the informal structure of how things actually work?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think you'll know, for instance, whether they're engaged in sector or industry partnerships from their website pretty quickly. What that actually means you might look at you might look at a grant that they gave. And I think I can't overestimate the value of finding somebody who might be another labor person or somebody that you know from a community organization to do those informal interviews.
That's great. Thank you.
And, you know, when you meet with your local chief executive officer and your local WIB executive director, it's not like you have to know everything, but I would go in knowing some of those baseline questions.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Comments? Okay, I guess we'll end then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Tam. So great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. So do I just hang up, or do I wait till everybody else hangs up? Oh, yeah, you could just hang. Okay. Hi, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.